Hey everyone. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about services. And like Miranda said, we talked about services in the last community call. And so if you want to dig in yourself, there's this excellent guide out here that kind of walks you through step by step in whichever language SDK you want to use. So you can check that out. But now we also have in the Dagger/examples repo, we have some examples using services here too. And so I'll kind of start by walking through those real quick. Let me just paste these in here. And so we have some in each language again. And the idea behind these examples is, let's say you have some integration tests in your application that require some temporary database just to perform some end-to-end testing. And so all of these examples use some test framework to actually execute against the database. And then within the Dagger pipeline, we're going to be using services to stand up that database and connect those two parts. So here, just starting with Go, we've got our unit test here just called test database. And all it's going to be doing is a select one against our database, and then asserting that we get back a one back from the database. So kind of a silly example, but when we jump over to the pipeline, it lets us see that we're able to run Go test, and it's able to see our database and do all these things. So looking at the pipeline, and I'll kind of walk through these components real quick. So pretty basic Dagger pipeline, but in this case, the first thing we do here is create this database container. So we're using a container with Postgres 15.2. We're setting this password so that we know what password we can pass to our testing container. And then we're telling it to just run Postgres and expose like the default Postgres port. And then so now in the part of my pipeline where I'm actually running the Go test, the key thing I want to do here is do this with service binding, DB and database. So the variable database refers to this container that we just talked about. And then DB is just the name I'm giving it to it. And so that's basically its host name within the Dagger pipeline. So then when I set up the environment for my tests, I say the database host is actually DB, and that corresponds to the thing we just named it. So that when we connect to it, we just say, this is my host, DB. You can literally name it whatever you want. That's just what I chose for this example. And then when we run Go test here, it's going to connect to these things. We can look at the other languages real quick too, and then I can run it, and then I'll kind of show a more real world example as well. So if you look at Node, and so again, here we have like just a basic jest test setup here where we create a database connection and then do that select one and assert it to be one. And so we can kind of step through, but like, kind of the same stuff we pass in that environment. Now we have a database connection and we run a command against it and make sure that we get the right command back. So again, this pipeline looks very similar, just in JavaScript this time, where we set up that Postgres container, set our default password, and then when we set up our test container, we actually create that service binding and specify that host. Moving quickly on to Python. Again, we've got our database connection here. We do that select one and assert that to be one. And our pipeline, same deal. We get the Postgres container, set that password, and then set that service binding. So now, if I go ahead and I'm in the Go example right now, so I can say go run main.go, which will run that main pipeline, which we can look at it while we're running here. So again, we're setting up that container, pulling all of our things, because I may have gotten rid of caches between the last time I ran this and now. And then once that's up, we'll just run that Go test. So we've got that database started now. And I'll start up my Golang image and run. Now it's getting Golang 1.20. We'll pull that down. We wait for the internet. This is all great information. Hope everyone's reading every line as it goes by. There will be a quiz after. You see we got that Golang image, getting our required Go mods, which in this case, there's not very many, so we're just basically running this test, and then our test passed, and we're all good. And then it closed our database container. So, like I said, all these are on the Dagger example site, so you can download them and run them yourself right now. So let's jump into kind of a more real world, more complicated example real quick. So over here, I have forked a project called DBT, which people that work with data might be familiar with. It helps you with data things. So like, yeah, anyone in the data science space is probably familiar with DBT. But anyway, the point is it's this big project, and part of its testing capabilities is that it provides, this Docker Compose, so you can run end-to-end tests locally. And also within the GitHub Actions, they have this integration test, which sets up a Postgres container. So kind of a similar use case to what we just looked at. So let's look real quick at this Docker Compose because it maps really nicely to the concepts that we're looking at in that Dagger pipeline. So it sets up the service as the database using the Postgres image, sets that default user password database and the ports. And then to actually run the tests, they have this big test Docker file that installs all the dependencies you possibly want and runs this pytest command within that container. Similarly, over on the GitHub Actions workflow, there's some matrix options to run on different operating systems and different Python versions. And then within that, they use Tox, which is a Python testing framework, to say we're going to be running the integration test. Here's some variables that we need for that test. And then we're going to install Python. It does this setup Postgres, which we can take a quick peek at, but it has a different option for each platform. Installs the required Python tools, and then runs Tox. And so if you just look at that script real quick, which was under actions and here. So basically runs a script that just connects to that database using some, it first makes sure that we have Postgres installed, and then we connect to that database using these defaults credentials, and it kind of sets up the roles that are needed for that test. So jumping over to our Dagger pipelines, we've kind of looked at the different pieces that are involved in this pipeline. And again, with this project, when I cloned this to write this example, I've never used it before. I just knew from a friend that they have a Docker Compose that does their integration test. So I figured, okay, I don't need any deep knowledge of the tool itself. I can just kind of take that Docker Compose and turn it into a Dagger pipeline. So here's our Dagger pipeline. This is in Python because a lot of this project is Python. And so again, the first thing we do here is we create a Postgres container and give it some default credentials. There's a lot of assumptions baked into the rest of the end-to-end testing that these defaults are certain things. So I've through trial and error, I have gotten these to the right things. And then this step is a bit more complicated now, right? Because we're doing a lot more real world testing within this actual test container. So first we kind of set up this testing base, which I've decided to base on Python 3.11 Buster. And then we create that service binding and we mount our application to the /user app. We install some dependencies that it needs to run all these tests. So it needs the actual Postgres client to be able to run this setup DB script, right? It needs the Postgres driver because within Python, it needs that to be able to connect to Postgres. And then it actually uses, in some of the tests, it execs out to Git. So we need Git on this machine as well. And then we need Tox to actually execute that end-to-end testing. And then so all of this is kind of that shared base. So then we say, like, from this point on, let's not cache our actual setup and Tox runtime. So I've set this timestamp as an environment variable to not cache the rest of these operations. And I learned this the hard way too, because I got to this point at one point where I was running the end-to-end test, but the setup script had been cached, so everything fell apart. And so you want to make sure to not cache any of the steps here. And again, the setup DB part is that script that we were looking at that kind of sets up the default roles and database and everything that the end-to-end tests need. So we just set the credentials to be able to connect to our connected service and then actually run that script. And so again, the host is just called DB because that's what we named the service binding, and then the same credentials that we entered above. And then now we get down to the actual fun part, the integration test. So we set these same environment variables that we saw in GitHub Actions, right? So we set the test host to be DB, which we actually saw over in the Docker Compose. Right here, they set this to be database, which again is what this service is named for the Docker Compose. So we've set this, we've set all these things that we did see in that GitHub Actions, and then we just run talks. And then this being, a full suite of integration tests on an actual repository takes several minutes to run, so we can just look at the results here. I didn't quite get all of them working, so that we have 2 failed, but we did get 588 passed. So I think that's a success. There's some that assert that the host is localhost, which of course in this case can't be true for the database, and some other things that I just didn't fully spend the time to dig in and understand the repo, but we got 588 of them passed, so almost all of them. And this is just running, if we look at the last, we lost our session. Anyway, this is just running that Python integration test. Cool. All right, I've talked for long enough. Any questions? I see some chat. Let me pop it up. Okay, no questions.
Just saying hi, but this
Cool.
is definitely very cool. And then in terms of documentation, would the best documentation for people to go to be that services guide?
Yeah, definitely. So we have, again, this guide, and let me link that in the Zoom chat. And this is definitely the best way to go through it, or if you prefer to just download some code and run it, then we have this in Dagger examples, which is what we walked through at the start of that as well.